Okay, let's see. Okay, we're 1 minute delayed, but we only have 45 minutes overall, including Q&A. Hello, Brother Darren. God's blessings. We only have 45 minutes overall, including Q&A, so we'll get started now, and hopefully people would join. Sister Doreen, hello. Okay, let's get started. So, of course, the overall theme for the module is Science and the Bible, and right now we are in the fourth session, Bible and Creation of Life. In other words, mainly biology. Hello, 21 Olympus Mons. Hello. Biology is where we are now. 45 minutes overall this session. Unfortunately, we need to wrap this up sooner than usually because I have a training, 3 hours training after that at 6 p.m. London time. So we can only have 45 minutes now, including Q&A. Okay, let's set the agenda properly. Essentially, in terms of biology, in terms of life forms, we have two opposing worldviews: the biblical worldview and naturalistic worldview, namely Darwinian evolution or neo-Darwinian evolution. Now, how do we deal with this? Of course, they differ. They are not. They can't go hand in hand. They are different in nature, in terms of time scale, and in terms of order of events. And so let's begin by looking at the, now in terms of the biblical worldview, the support for that really comes from the fact that the Bible is reliable in terms of its revelation to the nation of Israel and to the in the person of Jesus Christ to the world. So using the reliable supernatural revelation, we go with the argument or the proposal from the Bible about the origin of life. That's a credible position to take, even without polemically dealing with anything else. Now, in contrast, if we come to the naturalistic worldview based on Darwinian evolution, what we are going to right now do is we are really going to critically evaluate or criticize some of the arguments made from there. Now, what is purported to be fundamental evidence for neo-Darwinian evolution, fundamental evidence? And the fundamental evidence comes from what is called stratigraphy. Study of fossils or study of the geological layers in various different parts of the world with fossils in them. So I could maybe quickly share. In the handout that you have, you should have some details of that already, but essentially maybe I can quickly show. Let me share my screen. Yeah, the fundamental evidence comes from this. On the right, for example, I just did a Google search for stratigraphy, and on the right you see, these massive this massive mountain, and what you would find is, if you look at the mountain close enough, you would essentially find layer after layer after layer of soil, essentially in multiple layers soil. And the idea is, the claim is that these multiple layers of soil have fossils in particular sequence, in particular order. For example, if I show you this, for example, fossils are found in particular order, and I don't know if this is a oops. Yeah, I'm not even sure if this is a serious resource or not, but as you can see, different fossils in different layers, and normally they are interpreted to be from different phases of time. The idea is these were the ancient life forms, and then they died away, and then new of life forms came and they died away, and so on. And newer life forms came, and more complex life forms have come about. So that's the main evidence advanced for claiming that species have evolved, life forms have evolved one from another. Now, these fossils, the particular, of course, you find layers like these in various parts of the world. Popular ones are Grand Canyon in the US and a few other areas like that. Now, using the particular arrangement of fossils, when you observe these, it is also claimed that in various layers you can use some fossils as references. So, for example, let's say there are A, B, C, D, E as reference fossils in 5 different layers here. And then if you go to another part of the world, and if you find 10 different layers, and if you find the A, B, C, D, E present in layers, let's say 2, 3, 7, 8, 10, then they would be matched with the 5 different layers that you find here. So in other words, you can use, people generally use the principle of using index fossils in one area, and index fossils, the same index fossils in the other area, and sort of equate those layers in terms of timeline. That's the idea. The interpretation given is these layers were deposited gradually over a long period of time. In other words, each of these layers were added, thousands of years after the previous layer. That's the idea. So this is supposed to show gradual deposition of soil, and therefore is going to capture life forms that lived in those particular periods. That's the idea of this. So slow deposition, supposed to capture millions of years worth of data, index fossils, and is supposed to show how early on in history there were more primitive life forms, and how later in history there were less primitive life forms. So that's the view. Now, to begin with, the first point we're going to find out is that this naturalistic worldview straight away conflicts with the biblical worldview, straight away, in the sense that this naturalistic worldview assumes something called uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism is really where there is an assumption that there hasn't been any major cataclysmic event in the entire world since the time of the formation of the cooling down of the earth 3.5 billion years ago. 3.5 billion years ago, earth soon after that arrived at an equilibrium state. Since then, any change on the earth has been gradual. That's the assumption. Any change on the earth has been gradual. And that is why that's an assumption used. And using that assumption, fossils are dated. And using that assumption, it is claimed that each layer is over thousands of years after each other, if not millions of years after each other. That's the idea. It's an assumption. It's crucially an assumption. If we go and challenge them and say, okay, uniformitarianism, is there any proof? They wouldn't be able to propose any proof. All they would say is it's an assumption. Now, they'd also possibly say that this is the best assumption we have. We can't claim we can't talk about a cataclysmic event which we have never seen in our history. What we have seen is what we project backwards. And here's where, of course, the Bible would contradict immediately, because in the Bible you have the worldwide flood during the time of Noah. During the time of Noah, the worldwide flood. you can see how tired I am when the flood happened during the time of Moses instead of Noah. Oh, I do apologize. Anyway, and so just to make a quick comment, the accumulation of fossils is agreeable to the biblical worldview, but the biblical when viewed from the biblical worldview, essentially we interpret these fossils or the accumulation of these fossils in an entirely different way. And the way we would interpret is by saying these were fossils to begin with because there was a worldwide flood, a worldwide cataclysmic event with rapid changes on the face of the earth, which is a necessary ingredient for fossil formation. A gradual event would not result in fossils forming. Fossils don't form normally. For fossils to form, you need to have extra special events, sudden cooling or sudden preservation needs to happen. And essentially, so we would view this and say this is a result of Noahic flood. The flood caused sudden changes on the surface of the earth, and therefore made millions of fossils to be deposited. So the different layers that we see in the biblical worldview do not correspond to millions of years separated from each other, periods of time separated from each other, but would rather correspond to different layers of soil deposited at rapid succession within the period of the flood. Rapid succession fossils being deposited. That's what we would see. Would that worldview allow for some sort of regularity in fossil layering, or some sort of regularity in the order of fossils? It would allow for that, some sort of regularity in the order of fossils, because for various reasons, there are all sorts of ideas that we could propose for seeing that behavior. For example, if there's a flood even today, and if 100 people were to die, perhaps the one who knows to swim would die last. And if there are 100 animals, 100 different life forms, multiple instances of 100 different life forms to die, then even there could be a pattern, because some life form could maybe handle the flood for longer than some other life forms, and so on. So we're not surprised by seeing patterns. So seeing patterns in the fossil record is fine for us. So simply put, what we are really saying is, what is presented as the evidence for Darwinian evolution, we are saying is the same, is the evidence for biblical flood. What is seen as evidence for Darwinian evolution is evidence for biblical flood, Noahic flood. And therefore, what is presented as sediments or accumulation of soil over a long period of time, we say is accumulation of soil over a short period of time. When they say there hasn't been a worldwide flood, hasn't been any rapid change in the surface on the earth for a long time, i.e. Uniformitarianism, we say, well, that's an assumption without any basis necessarily. It's not a scientific, it's not an observation-based assumption by definition, because it's an assumption. Whereas we would say, we can bring in a revelation from scriptures to say, and also historical evidence, historical claims made in various different cultures to say there has been a worldwide flood as testified by various different cultures. So same evidence, both look at, but with different lenses. In other words, what separates us from the naturalistic worldview is simply whether a flood happened or not, whether a worldwide cataclysmic event in the way of the flood happened or not. If it did happen, our worldview would be right in terms of seeing these as deposits in short succession to each other. So that's fundamentally where we are. And in that regard, again, if you refer to the book, The Old World, I have in chapter 2, beginnings, in terms of talking about the biology related argument, in the section where we have the chronological account of creation. I have this covered in terms of how, I have comments related to these layers, and essentially 4 specific points to be made. Let me read out those 4 specific points, and that should sort of summarize our argument in this area. Evolutionists, for the point number 1, evolutionists assume the fossil records are formed only due to gradual accumulation of sediments, and therefore each layer is laid over millions of years. This is clearly an assumption. This is an assumption. It's not based on any scientific proof of any sort, but rather an assumption. Starting point. This is clearly an assumption with no evidence to back up. In contrast, there exists plenty of archaeological artifacts that point to the fact that all the ancient civilizations had observed a worldwide catastrophic flood. So look at the evidence. Biblical worldview says this is because of the flood, worldwide catastrophic flood. The naturalistic worldview says, no, this is over millions of years, gradual deposition. Theirs is purely an assumption. Ours can be justified through messages preserved in various cultures, all of which, the ancient cultures, all of which talk about a worldwide flood. That's point number 1. Moving on to further comments about these fossil records. What we find is point number 2. Marine fossils, we find marine fossils high above sea level. And Dr. Andrew Snelling, in his article, What are some of the best flood evidences, written on Feb 13, 2015, notes that Kaibab limestone in Great Canyon has marine fossils about 7,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. These fossils could not have been formed without a catastrophic event taking marine beings high above their current abode and depositing them on high rocks. About 7,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level, we find marine fossils in some areas in Grand Canyon. The point is, if we are talking about gradual deposition, question is, how did marine beings end up 7,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level? How did that happen? They couldn't have crawled up. They are marine beings. And so to claim that these are gradual depositions and saying that 7,000, 8,000 feet above, at that particular point, these beings came or were deposited without claiming a cataclysmic event is absurdity. You can't do it. So that contradicts or that challenges the worldview that these are deposited over long periods of time gradually. Next one, multi-layer fossils. It has been observed many times that some fossils cut through multiple layers of rocks. This is a clear evidence of these fossils being deposited as a result of at least one catastrophic event, as in this case. Clearly, the many different rock layers are formed in rapid succession, say multiple layers laid out within a day to preserve the entire organism across different layers of sediment. Multi-layer fossils are again another evidence, another piece of evidence to say that, well, these fossils clearly aren't there as a result of gradual events, but rather as part of a cataclysmic worldwide event or cataclysmic event. You can't, if each layer is supposed to be a layer deposited over millions of years, you can't have one organism fossilized in its entirety where parts of it is in one layer and parts of it is in another layer. Simply can't happen. That's again another proof that these layers were formed in rapid succession to each other. Okay, the last point, living fossils. It is observed that species like coelacanths, I think is the right way of pronouncing, which should have been extinct about 65 million years ago, according to the evolutionist assumptions, because they do not show up in some of the higher rock levels, actually are alive even today. This is to say that if a species shows up as fossils only in a certain rock level and not later, there is no reason to think the former species were removed through natural selection. There are examples of animals or entities which are fossilized in particular layers and not later, which would be seen as entities which went into extinction at that particular layer because they can't be seen anymore, which are alive even today, as we can observe. So again, the point is, and therefore our view, or people suggesting the view that this is the different layers of fossils coming from the assumption that the different layers of fossils come from different parts in the history of the world, and which also indicate the extinction of these organisms, is simply untenable. Simply put, to summarize all of these, the point is we're looking at the same evidence, and the most important evidence we're looking at are these layers of soil formed, which people study in detail, including the fossils that are accumulated in different layers of these soils. And we're looking both biblical, people who hold on to biblical worldview and people who hold on to naturalistic worldview are looking at the same evidence. But they come from, the people who hold naturalistic worldview have assumptions in place using which they view this and say that this is evidence for long-term evolution. The assumptions include saying that the universe had, the earth had evolved, earth and things in the earth have evolved over a long period of time. That's an assumption. And then using that, they end up dating different fossils and come up with long dates. Assume it's old and therefore it is old. That's a circular way of reasoning. But with that assumption, they go on further to say these are layers formed over a long period of time, and that different fossils in different layers could be used as index fossils to date other areas of of soil in other parts of the world. So looking at that, the problem, we have specific challenges raised against that. Challenge number one, this assumes slow events, but worldwide flood hasn't been taken into account. Marine fossils are found high above sea level. That means that this is not from gradual events. We find fossils from multiple layers, again mean that these are not from gradual events. And we find fossils in layers deep within, meaning they've died a long time ago according to the assumption, but which are still alive as per observations, which means the assumptions involved in saying that these have died in the particular periods of time as specified by the soil layer is just an incorrect assumption. So at the end of this, the point is we can look at these fossils, different layers. They are from worldwide flood, Noahic flood, and that is a perfectly logical position to hold. And therefore, we're not talking about millions of years here. Or we are rather talking about several layers formed in quick succession. Well, just one minor comment about, I'm sure you'd have heard about fossils being found which are dated to several million years ago and so on. And you find that, time and time again, a fossil which is 12 million years old has been found in this area and that area and so on. The problem is all of those dating methods, the radiometric dating methods, the radiometric dating method, all of them have the assumption. When I say all, I mean there are different radioactive elements which are used to date in different circumstances. And generally speaking, any of them, because this is really common to any radiometric dating method, any of them, all of them assume uniformitarianism. And that's an assumption which presupposes that evolution is true, that naturalistic explanation is the only possible explanation. Because it presupposes that explanation, you end up with conclusions in measurements which comply with the presuppositions because they're used as input. When those assumptions are used as input, of course you'd end up getting those millions of years numbers. But when you use the Noahic flood, which is not a baseless assumption, but which is testified both in scriptures and in various cultures, then we can say, for fossils which date before, let's say, about 10,000 years or so, we really can't accurately date them because radiometric dating method, the principles in radiometric dating method wouldn't allow us to do that. We can't project things backward beyond that because of the cataclysmic nature of the flood. So with that having said, let me, so essentially in terms of summarizing, what I'm saying is naturalistic worldview, millions of years and so on, are purely based on assumptions with circular reasoning in place. And therefore, it's not a sensible thing to go with, and it doesn't take into account it doesn't take into account evidence from outside of biology, like history and so on, which are reasonable areas of science knowledge gathering also, but they don't take into account, and therefore they have a self-fulfilling prophecy of giving millions of years dates. But if you bring together all available evidence, then biblical worldview is the one which would make sense, because all cultures talk about the worldwide flood. Let's close our session there and open the floor for questions now. Sister Sybil, hello also. Any question on what we have seen right now? biblical worldview of looking at life and saying life did not evolve across the boundary of kinds as narrated in the Bible, and saying all of life only come from the last 10,000 years. Both of those points are completely logically tenable, and as long as Noahic flood is taken into account, there is nothing that we have found observed observed as per science contradicts that. Only when you preemptively reject Noahic flood, you'd end up having other conclusions in terms of long, very old fossils and so on. Biblical worldview completely consistent, perfectly reasonable to hold as long as you bring together necessary details from Noahic flood. Other worldviews, naturalistic explanation rejects information from history. Any questions at all? Okay, 21 Olympus Mon says, do they use fossils to date the age of the earth? How can they accurately say that the earth is millions of years old? Yes. Do they use fossils to date the age of the earth? Yes, they do. So if you carefully study stratigraphy, it's again a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's plenty of circular reasoning used, again, because you're really talking about people who don't know how logic works, how philosophy works. So what they would say is simply that naturalism is the only explanation that we have for the existence of Earth. So it is assumed Earth is 13.5 billion years old. The particular number doesn't matter. It is assumed the Earth has been around for a very long time, number one. It is assumed the different layers of soil or the different layers of today were rock, which was earlier soil, were accumulated over a long period of time. That's an assumption. It is assumed Earth has been long, very old. It is assumed that things have been gradually changing, i.e. naturalism is true. It is assumed those things. And so those things are assumed, and then they look at the fossils to then say, well, okay, we come up with a rough idea. Well, this layer corresponds to this many million years ago. That layer corresponds to those many millions of years ago, and so on. So that chart is then prepared, some sort of a rough reference scale. Is there any science behind precisely pointing out why something is millions of years old? No, it is assumed. These are based on assumptions. A chart is prepared in regards to the age of the period corresponding to different layers. Those are based on assumptions. Once they're based on assumptions, different layers are given specific time periods, then some special fossils which are prominent, which are all over the world, are used as index fossils. They are really used as reference fossils. So using index fossils, then, for example, if let's say for 500 million, for 200 million years ago, there'd be an index fossil, and wherever in the world where they see that particular layer of soil would be, wherever it shows up, if there is a layer, that layer would be claimed to be 200 million years old, and anything above that is younger than that, and anything below that is older than that. So using those fossils, layers of soil would be dated, and then other fossils would be appropriately dated. In other words, if you look, if you compress the long story short, it's simply something like use soil to date the fossil first, use the soil, assume things about the soil and date the fossil, and then use the fossil to date the soil. But then if you ask, well, but did you not assume the date of the soil to begin with when you were dating the index fossils? And therefore, to go from index fossils again to date of the soil is not right, because you'll of course end up with the number you assumed to begin with. That won't be properly appreciated. Of course, we can't produce a PhD thesis based on just this two statements, and therefore it won't be held credible. There are plenty of evidence where when people launch proper challenge, they are frowned upon in academic circles and sort of persecuted. Yes, 21 Olympus Mon says, so when they assume, could we say that it's more of a guess? Yes, they wouldn't even agree that it is a guess. They would say that is the truth. That the earth has been for a long time is the truth, is what they would say. In other words, they have a huge religion which they hold on to. A simple thing, a simple challenge that we can launch is just ask, if you study this in detail, you can just study how precisely the date corresponding to a particular layer is arrived at. And you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised as to the fact that there is no science involved there. Okay, any more questions? This is where philosophers are fighting hard against scientists. Even atheistic philosophers are fighting hard against scientists these days, because scientists are trying to completely ignore philosophy of science, to advance their own agenda. Philosophers are saying, don't do this. Scientists are advancing the idea that only science is the source of information. And that, of course, puts the jobs of philosophers in jeopardy, apart from the jobs of historians, and the other faculties. And therefore, people are up in arms. If you go to academic circles, and I've sort of interviewed personally various people who come from the same university campuses as some of the militant atheists who advance various ideas, and you'd be surprised as to how many professors, even atheistic professors, who are completely against these militant atheists in their own campuses, which won't be very evident outside of their campus, but that is reality. Okay, any further question? If not, we close it there. Has science itself become a sort of religion? Yes, it has. Well, not true science, of course. True science doesn't care. It doesn't speak. It doesn't stand up for itself. But the fake science that we have today, yes, it does. Online, you should find, I think a few years ago, there was a huge drive to get signatories of scientists, a list of scientists to really come out saying we are against Darwinism. And there was a huge drive, and I think several hundred actually signed the document saying, scientists, renowned scientists, coming up saying we are against Darwinism, but unfortunately hasn't picked up momentum from there. Okay, cool. No further question there. And I also need to wrap up in 2 minutes there. So what we would do is we would wrap up here right now, and yeah, we'd follow from our in our WhatsApp groups about this particular module. Thank you very much. God's blessings for patient listening. And okay, so 21 Olympus Mon says the training that you're doing later today is open to everyone. Yes, it is. It is meant to be for Christians. So essentially, 4-day training, 12-session training on what we call belief statements. Yeah, essentially that is open for everyone. But let me quickly find out if you want to join. Let me quickly find out the details. It's over Zoom. It's over Zoom, and let me find out the Zoom meeting ID is 861 0985. Okay, let me quickly paste that here actually. Thank you, Sister Sybil. Yeah, that's the meeting ID and password. It is over Zoom, not via YouTube, and that you have the details of the meeting there. But yes, open to every Christian. So if you can join if you want, and I'll be glad to meet you there. God's blessings to you all, and catch up later. Thank you. Bye.